I want to talk about the Zelda Timeline. Specifically, about how almost nobody seems to understand the Zelda Timeline. And no, I don't mean in the sense that it's too confusing, because it isn't. It can be explained in 3 sentences. I mean that most Zelda fans are unfamiliar with the development history behind the timeline, which in fairness is not entirely our fault. The Zelda Timeline is convoluted. Again, not confusing once you know all of the information, just complicated. It's compiled from decades worth of information, split between games, manuals, strategy guides, developer interviews, and other transmedia, and the vast majority of players are understandably not going to bother wasting their time researching all of it, which is kind of the point of Hyrule Historia, to compile all of that into one product. But the timeline didn't actually originate from this book. Honestly, I feel like even a lot of the people who actually like the timeline don't know the half of it. So, I want to explain why the Zelda Timeline, specifically as depicted in Hyrule Historia, was the way that it was, and how it came to be over the years. But to be clear, this isn't a video about Hyrule's fictional history. There are plenty of videos about that already, nor is it about whether or not the timeline makes sense, although depending on the comments I might discuss that in a future video. This is a video specifically about the history of the timeline's development in real life from the start of the series in 1986 to 2011, when Hyrule Historia released. I also want to talk about my opinions on how Eiji Aonuma has been treating the timeline since Breath of the Wild. More on that in a bit, but for now, let's focus on the timeline itself. There are a lot of misconceptions about the Zelda timeline. Right now, I want to focus on 2 specific misconceptions that have somehow, against all odds, persisted over the years. First is the notion that these games were originally never connected, with many people believing that there was basically no continuity between them until around Ocarina of Time. The second misconception I want to address is the notion that the timeline was basically just invented in 2011 to shut up fans. If you're a Zelda fan, then you've no doubt heard these arguments parroted ad nauseum. Perhaps you yourself believe them to be true. Well, to set the record straight, they are both patently false. Please, allow me to explain. Let's cover the games in order of release. Zelda 1 is self-explanatory. Zelda 2 was a direct sequel to Zelda 1, as was confirmed in its manual. A Link to the Past was a prequel to the first 2 games, as was confirmed on the back of its box and in its official strategy guide. Link's Awakening was a direct sequel to A Link to the Past, as was confirmed in its manual and official player's guide. And Ocarina of Time was a prequel to the whole series up to that point, as it was an adaptation to the origin story of Ganon in A Link to the Past's manual. This was also confirmed in a developer interview from 1998 when the game released. I'm going to keep going, but are you starting to see what I'm saying? So far we've covered the first 12 years of games, and not only have every single one of them had a confirmed timeline placement, we're also still perfectly matching the Zelda timeline as presented in Hyrule Historia. While timeline placements do start getting less straightforward from here, I think it's incredibly clear by this point that the notion that these games were originally never meant to fit together is factually incorrect. Majora's Mask is where things start getting a little convoluted. This marked the first time in the series that a game took place in an alternate timeline. As we all know by now, Ocarina of Time had 2 endings, one following Link after Zelda sent him back in time to the point before he pulled the Master Sword, at which point his friend Navi leaves him, and he leaves to meet with Zelda. The other ending follows the future time period Link left behind. Yes, I'm aware that at this time the existence of multiple timelines was not yet officially confirmed by Nintendo. However, it was always the case. Even if the devs hadn't considered this when making Majora's Mask, they still said it following the events of the child time period, as opposed to A Link to the Past, which was clearly following the events of the adult time period. Truthfully, there was never actually any ambiguity with this, and either way, the developers would go on to confirm this timeline split merely 2 years later anyway. More on that in a minute, but for now, onto the Oracle games. Unfortunately, their timeline placement was not readily available, as it wasn't stated on their boxes or in their manuals. Instead, it was confirmed in promotional material for the game. In an issue of 64 Dream Magazine, which was Nintendo Dream Magazine before it changed its name, there was an article about Oracle of Seasons. Here it is after being run through Google Translate. Go ahead and pause if you wish to read the whole thing. Now, obviously, this is an extremely rough translation. You know how Google Translate is. But that's fine, because the important detail here is clear, which is that the opening of the Oracle games directly follows the defeat of Aghanim and Ganon. The mention of Aghanim obviously explicitly sets it after A Link to the Past. Now, for just a moment, I'd like to digress for a bit. I've been a Zelda fan for basically my entire life, so I know that there's going to be at least one person in the comments who is going to try and argue that Nintendo Dream Magazine doesn't count as a credible source and doesn't confirm anything. And to that I would say, maybe. But what makes more sense to you? That the writer of this article was just making random things up, which just so happened to coincidentally match with its official timeline placement 10 years later? Or that this information was provided by the devs? I mean, I think the answer is obvious, but I suppose you be the judge of that. Next is Four Swords for the GBA. At the time of its release, the game didn't have any timeline confirmation. However, a little over a year later, in March of 2004, Eiji Aonuma would confirm in an interview with Game Informer that Four Swords was, quote, what we're thinking as the oldest tale in the Zelda timeline, which would place it directly behind Ocarina of Time. Which seems simple enough, however, there is a potential caveat to this answer, and that's the fact that Eiji Aonuma wasn't really involved with Four Swords development, which may, in your eyes, detract from the credibility of his statement. However, his usage of the word weir does seem to imply that its timeline placement was decided unanimously amongst the Zelda team. This placement clearly wasn't set in stone yet, however, but ultimately it didn't contradict anything, and would remain the same from this point onward, all the way up to the modern day. So, for all intents and purposes, this was its official timeline placement, confirmed many years prior to Hyrule Historia. Wind Waker is where everything falls apart. As shown in the game's intro, it was a direct follow-up to the events of Ocarina of Time. That was a key aspect of Wind Waker's plot, and in an interview with Eiji Aonuma from 2002, when the game came out, he said this: Ocarina of Time basically has two endings of sorts. One has Link as a child, and the other has him as an adult. This game, The Wind Waker, takes place 100 years after the adult Link defeats Ganon at the end of Ocarina. Okay, so the creators actually confirmed the existence of multiple timelines, and nearly a decade prior to Hyrule Historia. Unfortunately, that does not explain how we now have two different games which directly follow Ocarina's adult era. I think this is the point where many people gave up on trying to piece together a continuity. Sure, some would try, but it was just impossible without creating plot holes and ignoring the intended connections that already existed. Nintendo had simply created one too many sequels to Ocarina of Time without thinking about how that would affect the overall continuity of the series. Nevertheless, the series would obviously keep going. The next game was Four Swords Adventures for the GameCube, and in that previously mentioned interview with Game Informer, Aonuma stated that it took place sometime after Four Swords, which obviously conflicts with its eventual timeline placement, so we'll place it off to the side here. But this is it. This is the one game in the entire series that's chronological placement would be retconned by the time of Hyrule Historia. Let that sink in. Is it sunk in yet? Cool, let's continue. Minish Cap was easy. It was the origin story for both Vati and the Four Sword. Easy. Twilight Princess took place after Ocarina of Time in the Child timeline. In addition to all the callbacks to Ocarina, this placement was explicitly confirmed by Aonuma only a couple months after the game's release. Easy. Phantom Hourglass was a direct story sequel to Wind Waker, starring the same cast of characters and summarizing Wind Waker's plot in its intro. Spirit Tracks was a follow-up to Phantom Hourglass. It took place in a new kingdom founded by Tetra, and featured the character Nico in his old age, as well as Alfonso, the grandson of Gonzo, and Linebeck III. Both games also had clear timeline confirmations from official sources, too. Easy and easy. Lastly is Skyward Sword, which was obviously meant as the first game in the series. It was the origin story of the Master Sword, and it took place before Hyrule Kingdom's founding. It also finally gave an explanation to the concept of the cyclical battle between good and evil that was originally introduced way back in A Link to the Past. And finally, it released within a month of Hyrule Historia, as a dual celebration of Zelda's 25th anniversary. And now finally, we can talk about Hyrule Historia itself. specifically the official timeline presented within it. Obviously, before it was ready to be published, there were a couple of loose ends to tie up, and this is unfortunately where I'm going to have to get into some mild speculation. Starting off, Four Swords Adventures needs to be addressed, as its original timeline placement was somewhat contradictory with Ocarina of Time. So let's attempt to put ourselves into the mindset of the developers here. Obviously, we cannot factually know why the devs chose to place it after Twilight Princess, but we can make an educated guess.
I'm gonna read your thoughts.
As we already know, it takes place after the original Four Swords, but once again, it featured Ganon, so it couldn't take place before Ocarina, Ganon's origin story. You might be thinking, well, it's an entirely different Ganon, right? So maybe it could take place before Ocarina. But that couldn't work, because Ganon was sealed at the ending, not killed, so he couldn't have been reborn in Ocarina of Time, as he never died in the first place. As previously mentioned, it also couldn't take place in the adult timeline because Hyrule was flooded. And no, it couldn't have been in New Hyrule either, because the game starts off with the release of Vati from his seal in the Four Sword Sanctuary, the very same sanctuary he was sealed at the ending of the original Four Sword, meaning this must be original Hyrule. So that leaves the child timeline and the timeline following A Link to the Past. This game also features a brand new Ganon, meaning it must follow a game where he was killed rather than sealed, which leaves three options. 1. Following Twilight Princess. 2. Following the first two games. And 3. Following the Oracle games, which I personally think would have been a good option, as it would have neatly explained how Ganon returned for Zelda 1. As for why they chose the child timeline, we can't be sure. But if I had to guess, I'd say most likely just to fill it out a bit more. And to explain Ganon's return in Zelda 1, they included a passage detailing that he was recently resurrected, but retained no intelligence due to his previously botched resurrection in the Oracle games, which explains why he had no dialogue in the games that follow it. And with that last game figured out, all that was left was to explain this third string of games, what we now know as the Heroes Defeated timeline. And there it is, the official Zelda timeline. And hey, it's clear if you know your history of the franchise that aside from this one game, it definitely wasn't just thrown together 25 years after the fact, but rather slowly developed over time with each new release. Yes, the devs obviously needed to invent a reason to justify why they made 3 sequels to Ocarina of Time, but that doesn't mean that they hadn't already made 3 sequels to Ocarina of Time. The order itself just came before the explanation. But even still, many people would try to find a way to rearrange them into a singular timeline. But that just wasn't possible and always resulted in massive plot holes. Because of course it did. All 3 of these games were intended to follow Ocarina of Time. Did the devs think that through? Probably not. But that still was the intention during their development. And that's clearly what we're seeing here. In a way, it's the development history of the series canon, recontextualized in universe as a timeline. And on that note, it's always kind of bugged me when people make arguments like they should have put so-and-so game here instead, such as swapping them around for the sake of doing away with the third timeline. Because that actually would have been just disingenuously making things up 25 years after the fact, which is what many people mistakenly accuse and criticize the timeline of being. But that wasn't what Eiji Aonuma gave us. For better or for worse, he didn't lie to us. The official timeline was, for the most part, the honest, authentic order that these games were always meant to connect to each other. It just needed a piece of retroactive continuity to fit together neatly. And that brings me to the next section of this video, which is, why does there need to be a timeline in the first place? This is a question I see popping up all the time. Why does Zelda need to have a timeline? Pretty much all the games are created to be able to stand on their own. Even the direct sequels don't require you to have played the previous game. So what's the point of there being a timeline at all? The answer is, there isn't one. There is no need for a timeline. There just is a timeline. There is a timeline because that's just the nature of creating sequels set within the same world that have clear connections to one another. No, Zelda games are not like Final Fantasy. They don't all take place in different fictional universes. Zelda games take place in the same world, and reference each other constantly. Take a look at Resident Evil, for example. Pretty much every mainline Resident Evil game can be enjoyed in a vacuum. You don't need to play Resident Evil 1 in order to understand Resident Evil 2. Their stories don't really have anything to do with each other outside of a handful of references. Nor do you have to play Resident Evil 2 in order to understand Resident Evil 3. And keep in mind, this series has its fair share of prequels too. Hell, a lot of the fanbase hopped onto the series with RE7, and none of them had any issues understanding its story. That's just how these games are written, because if you create a necessity to understand the lore in a long-running franchise, you create a massive barrier to entry, so they don't. But that doesn't mean that there isn't continuity, and you don't see Resident Evil fans arguing over whether there is or isn't a timeline. There just is. Not because there's necessarily a need or a point to having a timeline. That just is the nature of creating sequels and prequels within the same world that connect to and reference each other. However, just because there isn't necessarily a need for the Zelda timeline doesn't mean there's nothing of value in it. Here, let me give you an example. In Wind Waker, Link owns a small shield, the Hero's Shield, which was a family heirloom supposedly passed down from a hero of the past. But the Hero of Time never used this shield, and the Hero of Winds was even stated to have no connection to the Hero of Time, for obvious reasons. So where and who did this shield come from? Well, a couple years later, Minish Cap released, with a confirmed timeline placement prior to Ocarina of Time. And look at that, the hero of Minish just so happened to own a shield of this very design, which was gifted to him by Zelda at the Picori Festival. The Zelda Encyclopedia even points out that they might be the same shield, meaning that the Hero of Winds might just be the blood descendant of the Hero of Minish. That's freaking awesome! And further than that, this shield design only appears in one other title here, Four Swords Adventures. But you don't find or buy the shield in that game. No, you already own it at the start. A family heirloom, perhaps? The Zelda series is chock full of fun, interesting little details like this that you'd only ever really notice if you pay attention to the timeline. And really, that's why people care so much about it. It's fun. That's the point of the timeline. It's just fun for some people. But of course, it's not fun for everybody. Half of the fanbase doesn't really care about the lore. For every Zeltic, there's an Egoraptor. And that's fine, that's not a knock at either of those guys. Everyone has their own tastes, and that's the great thing about Zelda's lore. As I mentioned earlier, these games are designed with the intention of catering to both types of fans. The overarching story is there, but it isn't necessary to enjoying the series on a game-by-game basis. It's a lot like Breath of the Wild story. Yes, it has one, quite a good one, but it's entirely optional. If you want that story, it's up to you to go out of your way to find it by piecing together Link's memories, details from characters' dialogue, and the various journal entries scattered around the world. But none of that gets in the way for someone who just wants to play the game and enjoy it as a game. In this way, I've always viewed Breath of the Wild as sort of a microcosm of the Zelda timeline itself. The story isn't forced on you, but it is there for the people who want it. So, for everyone who asks why there needs to be a timeline, I would personally answer with, it's totally valid to not care about the timeline, and to just enjoy each of these games as their own thing. But in that case, the timeline's existence doesn't affect you. So, why do you care? Zelda does both. Although, ever since Hyrule Historia, and especially after Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, I've been seeing this sentiment floating around that it might be time to just do away with the official timeline, to just pretend it never happened. But, like, what does this mean? Get rid of the official timeline, what does that mean? What, like, choosing to pretend that Wind Waker's story isn't directly, explicitly the result of Ocarina of Time? Pretending that the creation of the Four Sword and the Rise of Vati could somehow take place after either of these games? Pretending that these games don't have booklets and boxes that explicitly confirm their connections to one another? Hey, perhaps if we shut our eyes and skip past the dialogue, we could pretend like Skyward Sword's timeline placement isn't woven into its plot. We can't get rid of the timeline, any more than we can get rid of the flour in a loaf of bread. It's baked into it. If Nintendo wants, they can contradict the timeline with newer games, but at this point in the series, that's just intentional bad writing. It's plot holes for the sake of it. Which brings me to the final topic of this video, how Nintendo has been handling the timeline since Breath of the Wild. In an interview published within Creating a Champion, Eiji Aonuma revealed his reasoning for why Breath of the Wild was not given an official timeline placement. Quote, "In books like the recently released Zelda Encyclopedia, we revealed where each Zelda game fell on a timeline, and how their stories related. But we didn't do that for Breath of the Wild. There's a reason for that. We realized that people were enjoying imagining the story that emerged from the fragmental imagery we were providing. If we defined a restricted timeline, then there would be a definitive story, and it would eliminate the room for imagination, which wouldn't be as fun." In a more recent interview with Game Informer, director Hidemaru Fujibayashi said, quote, "I kind of want to pose the idea that, like in real-life history, you define by the artifacts and by the data you currently have. So, within what we have, there might be a correct answer, but it could be a different answer." To which Eiji Aonuma added, "The Legend of Zelda is a series of games that focus on puzzle solving, so this is just another sort of puzzle that the users will have to see if they can solve and think about." Mr. Aonuma and Mr. Fujibayashi, in my opinion, this sounds amazing. I love what you're saying here. I love the idea of the chronology being a puzzle that we, the fans, figure out by piecing together bits of evidence found throughout the games, as if we were actual historians trying to make sense of various historical events. I think refraining from blatantly confirming timeline placements going forward, and instead allowing the player to figure it out through the small bits of evidence you provide in-game, what you refer to as fragmental imagery, is perhaps the most graceful, suitable, and most importantly, fun way of handling the timeline. But that's not what you're doing. Instead, it seems more like you've taken every opportunity you could to make it impossible to figure out a cohesive timeline placement. Tears of the Kingdom's lore isn't a puzzle to be solved. A puzzle is something that has an answer. But you've included details here that seem by design to prevent answers. This isn't a puzzle. You've just given us mismatching pieces, then encouraged us to figure out how they fit together. You say you want us to approach it like real-life history, but the thing is, there actually are answers in real history. That's why historians exist in the first place. Because even if they don't yet know the answer, even if they may never know the answer, they know there at least is an answer. But if you take away that assurance, you take away the reason to try at all. You say you want fans to theorize, and with how happy you say it makes you to hear our theories, I truly do believe that. But you're actively making choices that stomp out our motivation to theorize, as well as giving credence to the common argument that people should just stop caring. Is that what you want? For your fans to just stop caring?
It's an entire world, okay? There are so many things to talk about in Tears of the Kingdom. What's this person's story? What's that person's story? You know, whatever. And we could explain lore all day long, but here's the thing. It's not that interesting anymore. I remember when I was a kid, the first time that I played Wind Waker, and the intro segment, described the events of Ocarina of Time. I was a kid. And I saw that. And that was amazing to me. I was like, wow. To me, and again, that's not cool to everybody, but it's cool to people like me. It's interesting to people like me. And that's my problem with Tears of the Kingdom. And honestly with Breath of the Wild too, but more so Tears of the Kingdom. It's like none of that stuff matters anymore. Tears of the Kingdom's story is not that interesting to me. Basically, I'm really not going to do videos on Tears of the Kingdom anymore.
The game's director, Hidemaru Fujibayashi, has stated that the game's connection to previous titles has been left deliberately vague, but suggests that this Kingdom of Hyrule could instead be another Hyrule. But it feels unnecessary and somewhat hollow. This would completely sever both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom from the games that came before. This Hyrule isn't the one we know, it's something completely new, and is worse off for it. Even without directly referencing previous Zelda games, Breath of the Wild was able to benefit from their world building. Just by taking place in the same Hyrule, it made the game all the more magical. Zelda games don't need to constantly reference each other. They don't need to have concrete placements on a timeline. But they don't need to be islands. They can lean on the stories of the games that came before them.
This channel was making heavy inroads into becoming a Zelda-focused channel. That didn't happen. Post-release, my Zelda content tapered off. And I wasn't the only one. Go look at all of the big Zelda YouTubers. Not the ones focused on gameplay, the ones focused on lore. And you will find that they've only uploaded a handful of videos since the game came out. There seems to be a general disinterest and disappointment, especially when it comes to the lore. It is not a surprise that there are so few lore videos about Tears of the Kingdom, because if Nintendo isn't going to take their lore seriously, then many people are going to see that and become discouraged.
For all I know, you might provide an answer to this conundrum in the future, just like you've done in the past with the Downfall timeline. But given the sentiment of your recent quotes, I feel like that's probably the exact opposite of what you plan to do. And now, more than ever, timeline theorists everywhere are going to be told to just give up. Ultimately, this is not a massive deal, and I'm not going to pretend like it is. They are just games after all. And these games are still fantastic works of art. I just think it's a real shame that this series, which once struck a balance by providing deep lore for the half of the fanbase that cared, while not getting in the way of the half that didn't, has kind of alienated the former. Mr. Miyamoto once referred to big breaks in the canon as a betrayal. I'm not sure if he meant that to sound as harsh in Japanese as it did in English, but I'm still surprised that you ended up doing exactly that. I understand that you clearly don't care about connecting the games nearly as much as you care about designing them. We've always known that. But I mean, you did produce, publish, and sell this book to thousands of people. So, if you don't really care to try and connect the games anymore, I can understand that. But maybe also don't continue trying to contradict it. And that's really all I wanted to say for now. Thank you for watching.